Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to our author's talk for August. An exciting new book and a big book that I'm holding up. I hear it's going to emerge across the screen. And as you can see in my screen, the beauty of this cover of the Carbon and Carbide building in Chicago is one of 100 buildings that have been included in this book, and as part of a project of 200 skyscrapers that were recorded by one of our speakers tonight, Chris Hytha, who is a designer and a visual artist from Philadelphia. Went to Drexel University and majored in architecture, and has been obsessed for, I guess, many of his young years, because he's still very young, but the last at least year and a half, in the project of pursuing across the country the Art Deco architecture of the 20s and 30s in American cities and beyond the borders of the great metropolises of especially early 20th century Art Deco in New York and in Chicago, to the industrial cities that boomed as city centers and as buildings of business, especially in the 1920s in places like Buffalo and Albany and Dallas and Pittsburgh. And indeed, our co-author for the evening, speaking about the text and the history that he's contributed to Chris's collections of photography, is Mark Houser. And Mark is a journalist who's based in Pittsburgh, and he is also a person who is very obsessed with skyscrapers and urban history, and gives walking tours, especially in Chicago, and is also the author of a book on high-rises art in Art Deco. I mean, in Pittsburgh, a kind of walking tour guide and in a individual building history. So the two of these speakers together, Chris and Mark, will present this a little independently, and we'll have Chris Hytha go first, and I will try to quickly get out of the way because as you will see in the book and the uniformity of this project of capturing in really exquisite detail through meticulous effort of drone photography and then of photoshopping, piecing together an enormously intricate portrait of the tops of these buildings, reveal all kinds of detail that are impossible to see from the street, and color and ornament that show a real lost art in the art of architecture in this period, which was so efflorescence in its attention to ornament and in detail. So I am going to invite Chris to come on first and to turn his screen on as I stop my share. So here is Chris Hytha, who is the obsessive photographer and technologist of photography, as you will see. And then I guess, Chris, you will introduce Mark so that he can take over next. I will return to the screen only briefly at the end of their talks to pose a question or two, but we hope that you'll insert your questions in the chat and address them to the Skyscraper Museum chat, and then I will interject those questions into the Q&A period, and Chris and Mark can answer either about their technique or about the history of these buildings. So Chris, please take it over.
Cheryl, thank you so much for the introduction. And Mark and I are both really excited to present to everyone and thankful to the Skyscraper Museum for having us. So this is really the easy part where I get to come and just share this work with all of you and not spend any more, nights in motels and long drives across the country. It's the past almost 3 years that I've been traveling to almost 70 different cities because all these buildings are just spread out across the whole United States, but I wanted to get all of the most interesting Art Deco buildings to, include in this book. So, of course, I'm going to talk about the book, but before I do, I want to share a little bit about my background. As Carol mentioned, I went to school for architecture at Drexel University. And while I was in school, I developed this passion for photography. And really, I was more interested in what could be rather than what is. I was never really a purist photographer that wants to represent like exactly reality. Rather, I used the skills I was learning in Photoshop to create these kind of fantasy cityscapes that were very much larger than life. And a couple more of these from my early days in architecture school. And eventually my love for architecture and what I was learning in school just definitely collided with my interest in photography. And I started to get this interesting hybrid, like these examples that are exploring the ideas of section perspective drawings that I would do in architecture. And I was applying them to photography to represent, transit underneath our feet in a city. And that leads me to the row homes project. So I graduated from architecture school and I had this summer of 2021 where all of a sudden I didn't have to work on school and I was able to apply that rigor of architecture school into my photography work. So rather than just taking random photos around Philadelphia, I wanted to do a larger collection of images that could tell a larger story. So the project was documenting 100 historic Philadelphia row homes. Of course, I'm here to talk about the high rises, not the row homes, but it's an interesting background, and I'm sure you'll see the visual similarities in this project. And also where I come from the editing side, again, how I wasn't really interested in just showing reality, but rather I want to be able to add my own creative interpretations and visual eye to my images. So for row homes, I was actually thinking of it like a designer, like an architect. I would learn about architectural representation, where we want to make very intentional decisions about how we convey a visual, because it's really communication. So for this project, because I wanted to share the individual character and personality of these houses, almost like portraits, I knew I wanted to do things like remove distracting power lines. Those aren't really adding to the image, or remove cars parked out front, like you see on the right side image. And one of my favorite things to do was to sample a color that was found in the house and replace the sky with that color to create this kind of, again, larger than life image that can really celebrate these otherwise, just mundane aspects of Philadelphia. These row homes are everywhere, but these images shine a light on them. Good time to talk about inspirations. Hilla and Bernd Becher were a German photography couple, and they really revolutionized this idea of documenting, architecture through photography in this really interesting method that I'm sure you can see the resemblance in my work today, 50, 75 years later, where they're keeping the composition consistent so that you can see all the subtle variations within a certain building typology. They were mostly focused on industrial fixtures of Germany, whereas of course I'm focused on the row homes and the high rises. Another clear difference is they were doing black and white documentation, and I'm doing this more stylized approach. That brings me to high rises. So why did I choose to document these old skyscrapers? Well, for one, going back to Hilla and Bernd Becher, I love the idea of a typology. I did row homes, and I wanted to find another building type that had a typology, a set of rules that defined it. Like row homes, they're a certain width, they're a certain height, and then there's all this great variety. And I found that these old skyscrapers were very similar in that, one, they're in the same time frame, 1920s, 1930s. And the other reason here, I worked in architecture. This was a building that I helped design, and I saw firsthand how a client's budget really restricts what you can actually do with an architecture project. And I saw this project get cut, cut, and cut. All the cool details were removed, and eventually the project was scrapped. So when I traveled around the country and started discovering these Art Deco skyscrapers, when I saw the tile work at the tops of these buildings, hundreds of feet up, where no one would ever even get close enough to really experience it, or these eagles carved at the top, it just gave me another level of appreciation for what they gave to us, these builders from the 1920s and 30s, how they contributed to our cities and the beautiful architecture they left us. So reflecting on this project and this effort from the past few years, I boiled it down to these 3 points that I think make the project important. So one, of course, is detail, showcasing these details high above the street that no one really gets to see. The next is discovery. Everyone knows about the Chrysler Building in New York, of course, but there are all of these incredible Art Deco buildings that I certainly didn't know about, even having gone to architecture school and taken history classes. And I'm sure there are many that you guys haven't seen as well that the project aims to just shine a spotlight on. And the third is documentation. This project really just finds these buildings as they are. Some are abandoned, some are kind of underutilized, some have recently been redone, some have been converted to apartments or hotels. So it's an interesting survey of kind of how we're treating our old skyscrapers. Starting with detail, so the choice to do just the tops was really fun early on to kind of like formulate the idea for this project. And I knew I wanted to do just the top because the rest of the building is repetitive, right? Kind of like a column. Buildings have a base, a middle, and a top. And the crown or the top of the building is really what defines it on the skyline. And usually that's the only way you actually experience it, just as a silhouette on a skyline. But now this project can offer an opportunity to get face to face and look at the top of the building up close. And this idea of building portraits, I mentioned it with the row homes, but I love that this starts to resemble almost like a yearbook for a lot of ways. One, the consistent composition, right? The consistent lighting also could be similar to like yearbook photos where the subjects come in and sit down and get their photo taken. And it's subtle things too, like a blurred background that subtly differentiates the building from the surrounding context. And of course, this idea of detail, I needed to get high resolution images, and I'm going to talk about how I achieved that in a moment. So now just to share some of the fun details I've discovered across the country, just a few of them, and specifically looking at ornamentation that's actually communicating something about the location of the building or about the culture and the time that it was built. So this is Louisiana State Capitol in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And you can see the guardian angels that are, symbolizing the power and strength of the state and the protection that the state provides, as well as on the right side, this flora and fauna. There's, a bird depicted there and different trees that are all local to the region. And the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, this building was built for a hospital, for a clinic. And on the right, you can see they actually paid homage to the nurses that helped make this clinic what it is by carving them in stone or terracotta at the top of the building. And then in the middle, there's also this wild kind of fantasy griffin character, which I don't think that has anything to do with the hospital, but I think it's a really cool feature of this old Art Deco building. So the next aspect here, the next intention is discovery. So how are these buildings found? I actually utilize Google Earth more than anything. I spent hundreds and hundreds of hours the past few years on Google Earth, just flying over pretty much every city in the United States, and I could basically analyze the stock of buildings. Usually I could identify which ones are old, even though this isn't super high resolution, they have all of these cities pretty much 3D modeled for you to explore. So the left side isn't a high-rise image. That's actually just a screenshot from Google Earth. So I would fill folders on my computer up with these screenshots to get an idea of like the different variety of buildings and get an idea of which buildings I wanted to capture. And then I would use that to start planning my travels and actually taking the photos. And some interesting buildings I discovered. This is the Genesee Valley Trust Building in Rochester, New York. It's a small building, but when I found it, I was just like shocked at how unique and different it is. It reminds me of like the Eye of Sauron in Lord of the Rings, if you're familiar with the Lord of the Rings trilogy with the two wings at the top. Just utterly surreal, and the fact that they built this pretty much right when the Great Depression was starting and they didn't cut these wings out of the budget is bizarre to me. Another interesting smaller building that you might not be familiar with in Cincinnati, Ohio, this is the Times Star building. And again, it just has this beautiful ornamentation all the way up at the top of the building. You can make out some like animal skulls at the top, as well as these Art Deco stylized figures carved into the corners. And again, the eagles. In my studies, I found a lot of like references to eagles. Pre-Great Depression, it was a very proud time for America and a very optimistic time and a very wealthy time too, with the Roaring Twenties. And I love how these buildings really reflect the energy of this era. Another interesting one, Fort Worth, Texas, I would have never known is this hub of Art Deco architecture, kind of like Tulsa, Oklahoma is as well. And this is just one of the many interesting deco buildings they have there with these iconic two towers, which differs from many that would include the typical Art Deco kind of step back form. This one changes it up a little bit. So documentation, like I said, this project finds buildings as they are, and some unfortunately are abandoned, but there's hope for them. On the left side, this is the Steric building in Memphis, Tennessee. And I'm actually talking with the developer. I gave him my drone survey because it might help them with the facade restoration. And they have a 10-year plan to hopefully bring this building back to life. Because you can see it's looking very tired after being abandoned for 30 years. The center is the Superman building, it's known as, but it's the Industrial Trust building in Rhode Island. And again, there's news and there's hope to bring this building back and fill it with tenants once again. And the one on the right is the Wilshire Professional Building in Los Angeles. This one, I don't know what the news is, but I hope they're able to save it. And then conversions. It's really interesting. In post-COVID times, we hear stories about these towers in New York, right, that can't get office tenants. And the idea of converting a office building into residential or hotel is a little bit tricky. Our modernist buildings don't really, they're not very conducive to residential. But interestingly, our stock of older skyscrapers, like these Art Deco ones I've studied, are much more suitable for conversion. So all of these were built as corporate headquarters at one point or another, but now they've been converted into hotels and apartments. Now, I love this section of the presentation. This is times where I've noticed that builders came along and didn't have the same respect or ideas about architecture as the craftsmen in the 1920s and 30s had. This is the Rust Building in San Francisco, and I'm sure you can see dead center here. I'm guessing that it was some executive up on the top floor that wanted some more light in their office or something. So they just blew out this section of the wall, totally disregard the, beautiful original Gothic detailing up here. And the window's not even centered. And it just shows you how far we've diverted from the beauty that they added to the tops of these buildings to nowadays, oh, no one's going to see it. We don't even care. Another example in San Francisco is the Sir Francis Drake Hotel. And I relate this to like a modernist tumor that's growing on this beautiful old Art Deco building, which of course this addition was added much later, but it's really weathering much worse than the stone that has been there 100 years. And again, the window isn't centered on the facade. It seems like there was no real care or consideration for what it looks like on the outside. So it's a very different approach. Another interesting one I discovered, a beautiful building in general in Columbus, Ohio. This is Levesque Tower, also known as AIU Citadel. And if you look in the center, you can see that these figures are missing their heads. And on the right side here, there's something about the facade that just looked wrong to me. Like I said, from my studies, I see the beauty and elegance and form and proportion that the designers used in the 20s and 30s. And these windows are kind of odd. So I thought something was up. And doing a little bit more research, I found these incredible historic images. Look at the sculpture in the center and take a moment to find the figures to get a sense of scale. This is a massive, massive sculpture. And there were 4 of these, if you look on the left, perched up 30 or so stories high on this building. So it really must have been a sight to behold. But unfortunately, I believe pieces of it were falling down to the street after getting struck by lightning, so they had to remove them. And again, with the eagles on the right side showing the patriotism of this era of building. This one has some redeeming qualities where you can see the antennas were covered up with this brick screen to try to make them blend in, but I definitely saw it through my drone's eye. But hey, at least they tried. So how the images are made. I thought about trying to do this, from a helicopter or from adjacent rooftops, and it would have been too expensive or logistically challenging. So drone was the best way to go. So I got my Part 107 drone license, and there's a lot of logistics behind the scenes of getting FAA clearance. Flying downtown, often you're in controlled airspace near airports. So you actually have to submit airspace requests, you put your time in, and the zone you're flying in, and you work with the FAA to get that approved. Flying at sunrise also, it has the perk of having great light, but also less traffic and less people out on the streets is helpful. So first I would pick the facade I want to photograph. This is the carbide and carbon building as an example. And I decide the extents that I want to get. My drone shoots landscape images, so I could crop, but that would yield pretty bad resolution. So instead, I take several images as I ascend the facade, kind of like a scanner would scan a document, right? And then manually in Photoshop, I stitch all of these close-up images together to get higher resolution. Then again, manually, I cut each building out. It's, kind of like scrapbooking in the old days where I'm zooming in and just cutting and tracing around the outline of the building. And I also make sure to get a background image while I'm photographing and composite the two together. Because if you noticed in the previous slide, the background gets all messed up from the changing perspectives. And then this is the fun part where I do a lot of local editing. So I'm making selections for the stone and separate selections for the gold, and I'm painting in light as well. And this gives me fine control over the image. So you can see how I changed the color of the stone to make it actually more representative of how the stone is. The left image, the sun was kind of washing it out, making it a different color. But in reality, it's this deep green. And the shadows and light are really important because these images are flat, two-dimensional. So lighting is the best way to communicate the form of these buildings to the viewers. So you can see I painted in light on the left light on the right and shadow on the left. And that's how I get this great detail where you can see every brick line and you can see where repairs have been made. And, you could never see these buildings up close like this without all this work. So now that most of these images are created and, again, I get to do presentations like this to share the work, another facet of this is exhibitions. So from the very beginning, with all this work to make them high resolution, I knew I wanted to print them large and have them on display. And they're currently up at the Chicago Architecture Center. So if you find yourself in Chicago before the end of the month, they'll be taken down August 26th, but you'll be able to see them. And they'll be in Detroit also in September. I also built this architectural model of the carbide and carbon building just to pay tribute to the designers and to get more, knowledgeable about it and kind of another way to respect the craftsmanship and the design of this building by recreating it and really understanding it. A final thing I'll leave you with, this is just a fun exploration in AI. I'm sure you are all familiar with generative AI, and this was just a fun experiment of feeding my high-res images into the AI and prompting it with things like, make the coolest skyscraper ever, and seeing what it spits out. And I think it's fun to just envision how we can use the craftsmanship of the 1920s and maybe let it inform something for the future of our skyscrapers. So in conclusion, I've been really inspired by what I've discovered across the country. I'm really excited to share it. And really my intention is to shine a new light on these buildings, document them in a new way, and hopefully get them in front of, the architects and designers of tomorrow to maybe make some more beautiful buildings in the future and maybe introduce some more ornamentation to make our cities more beautiful. So with that, I'll bring up Mark Houser, and I appreciate the opportunity here. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. I have to say, I always love watching Chris describe his his process in making these buildings. I've had the privilege of accompanying him on many of the trips across the country and watching him do this himself. And it's pretty spectacular, the work that he does. So I'm going to go ahead and share up this screen here. And hopefully that's all nice to see now. So I'm borrowing from Chris, because he's the artist, this fantastic opening screen with the 3 buildings from Highrises. But I'm picking 3 new ones. And these are, of course, all Art Deco buildings from New York City that you're all familiar with. Of course, when I ask people to think about, so I'm a historian, I'm a writer, I'm a former journalist and a freelance writer. And I've written a couple books about skyscrapers, the most recent being Highrises Art Deco with Chris. And when I ask people to think of a skyscraper, it's kind of interesting to me, because people tend to think about these buildings, you know, the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, buildings that are frankly 100 years old almost. So if I ask you to think of a car or an airplane or a telephone, you're not thinking of something that's 100 years old, but these buildings have sort of cemented themselves in our brain as the perfect exemplar, you know, the exact idea of a skyscraper, the platonic ideal of a skyscraper, something 100 years old. And I think that's meaningful. I mean, these are the 3 tallest buildings in the world in the early 1930s. 2 of them are over the 1,000-foot mark, which made them taller than the Eiffel Tower. So America jumped back into the forefront of tallest building in the world. And the one on the left, by the way, is one that may not be familiar to everybody, but some of you folks may recognize. The city's service building. So this was built by the company that we now know today as Citgo. And one of the things I like about this project is the opportunity to draw our attention, as Chris mentioned earlier, to buildings that are not famous. So this is the interior of this building. And you can see on the floor, this triangle, that's the logo of the company we now know as Citgo. And the balconies up on this building were, you know, they were an amazing opportunity to look out over the harbor in 1932 and look out from a great height. These were actually the balconies for the executive boardrooms and some of the executive offices up there. And the top floor was supposed to be the company founder's penthouse, but it turned out that that gentleman found himself with arthritis and wasn't really able to take up his time there. So instead, it turned into this great observatory that you can see in a picture from the 1930s. And the history of these buildings is what appeals to me. And this history is still relevant today. Chris and I happened to be in New York earlier this summer, speaking to the New York Art Deco Society. And we ventured on top of this city services building, which is now known as 70 Pine, its address. And great place. Overstory is the name of the cocktail bar. I highly recommend you go there and take in the views. And the top floor still has in the terrazzo that Citgo logo. It's a private dining room now. They said that LeBron James came up the steps there with some of his friends to have a little dinner. But I like learning the stories behind these buildings because I think that helps them come to life. So on the left is Henry Doherty, who founded City Service, which was a holding company for gas and electric utilities. He's from Columbus, Ohio, and he moved to New York. And in 1905, he opened his company, and he was on a skyscraper on the 14th floor in Wall Street. And he loved skyscrapers, and he dreamed of having his own. And in fact, in about 1920, this was the dream he had. He would have twin towers down there at the Battery. And you can see that triangular Citgo logo on top of them. So you can see at the time, those weren't going to be super skyscrapers. They're considerable buildings, but neither of them is as tall as the big giants on Broadway, the Singer Building and the Woolworth Building. And though they have that setback look that the high rises of the 1920s came to utilize, they still aren't quite what that city service building came to be. Because modern skyscrapers, the skyscrapers of the 1920s, the Art Deco era, as short as that era was, it was a fantastically influential era for the construction of skyscrapers, for new designs, for new ideas, all of which we now come to put under the term Art Deco. But it's important to know that that is not a term that people used at the time. It comes from a 1924 or rather 1925 show in Paris of decorative arts décorative. But the term Art Deco really only came into widespread use in the 60s and 70s to describe these buildings of really almost less than a decade, from about the early to mid 1920s to the early 1930s, when the Great Depression basically shut down construction of skyscrapers. Now, the style continued in other ways, but not in skyscrapers. We stopped building them when the Great Depression hit. But take a look at these buildings and see how much they resemble some buildings from a little bit earlier. So New York was perfectly familiar with skyscrapers. They'd had many of them. This image on the left is from 1908, and it's a famous illustration of what the future held, King's dream of New York. What will skyscrapers look like in a few years, as thought of in 1908? And what I love about this, I have a collection of antique postcards of old skyscrapers, because that's how people used to share these images. Postcards are about as old as skyscrapers, right? So people would share these pictures, and this was a futuristic one. And the one on the right is actually from the late teens. So it's been updated. And it is what I find tremendously wonderful about this, and the postmark you could see in the center is from 1921. So people are still mailing this. This is relevant in the early 20s. This is what the future of skyscrapers is. And you can see the buildings haven't changed at all. What's changed? Well, what's flying, right? So instead of having zeppelins and airships, now we have rigid wing, flights that are going to take us to the Panama Canal. So all the people knew about skyscrapers in the late teens was we're going to have a lot of them. And they weren't wrong. This is New York City, looking down Broadway, up past City Hall, down towards the Battery. And this is taken in about 1910 from one of the new tall buildings. Let's pick out some of the landmarks to see what these people in turn of the century New York had already seen happen. So on the left is Joe Pulitzer's New York World headquarters. That's the world's first 20-story skyscraper. And it's got the gold dome on top, sadly not here anymore, but more than 300 feet tall, the tallest skyscraper in the world in 1890. And then here's the tallest in 1899, the Park Row building, now almost 400 stories tall. And then the tallest building in the world, the tallest skyscraper that is, in 1908, the Singer building, more than 600 feet tall. And then in 1912, the new tallest building, the Woolworth building, 800 feet tall, 50 stories, more than 50 stories tall. So you can see just in the course of about 2 decades, how much that downtown skyline had changed in New York City. And it started to make people crazy. This is a New York Times 1911 article. Are American cities going mad architecturally? And who's saying it? Not just anyone. This is the architect of the Singer building, which in 1908 became the tallest skyscraper in the world. Now, maybe he's a little bit sour grapes about the fact that the new Woolworth building that's going up is going to take the title from him. But even so, the words that he chooses to use to criticize skyscrapers are really remarkable. Here's what Ernest Flagg said. I am opposed to high commercial buildings. I think it was a great mistake to have ever allowed them to be built. They disfigure the city, and they shut out the light and dwarf into insignificance all the other buildings of the town. So this was the mood about tall skyscrapers then. Sound a little familiar, New Yorkers? So this is a couple years later in New York. Another newspaper has a story about the next great skyscraper to be built. And what I love about this article is that it's nostalgic, because at the same time they're organizing to build another building, which, by the way, never does get built. They're talking about demolition crews tearing down New York's first skyscraper, and it is only 26 years old. This is the Tower building. You can see it in the center of that photo on the right. And this building is 11 stories tall. And it is, according to the story, quote, and I love this old-timey newspaper writing. I used to write for a newspaper, so I have a soft spot. Quote, it is one of the best illustrations that can be given of the rapidity with which New York City has moved during the last quarter century. It came as an experiment, gained success in spite of general ridicule. Now it has outlived its usefulness. It cannot compete with the giants of its own family. And like all ancestors, it is to be laid away in the grave. Just that tone is a beautiful thing. I miss old newspapers, but this article also calls for something along the lines of a height restriction. We need to stop having these crazy tall buildings. American cities are going mad architecturally. So this actually brings about a major change in New York City, which is the first zoning ordinance that restricts buildings to start being receding away from the sidewalk with setbacks as they grow in height, so as to allow more sunlight to the ground. Another thing that occurred with skyscrapers that changed the looks of them pretty substantially happened not in New York, but in Chicago. Sorry, New York viewers. But this is Robert McCormick, the publisher of the Chicago Tribune. And in 1922, he held a contest offering a $100,000 prize to the architect who could come up with the most beautiful office building to be the new home of the Chicago Tribune. And the text says there that we must make the most beautiful building in the modern world. And hundreds of architects across the world applied. There were several that were invited actually by the newspaper. One of them was his cousin, McCormick's cousin, John Howells, who was a very busy man. And so John Howells hired another architect in New York who was hungry for work named Raymond Hood to come up with his contest entry. And so Howells and Hood's entry is this Gothic tower, which is based on the cathedral in Rouen in France, the tower on the right called the Butter Tower. And so this building for the newspaper, and that's Chris's high rise of it on the left, was built and won the contest. And so Gothic in 1922 is still the prevailing mode of making skyscrapers. It's the thing that represents tallness. But another thing that happened with this contest is that new ideas started to come to the fore because it was widely publicized. And so people got to see all the entries, hundreds of them. And one of them in particular from a Finnish architect named Elio Saarinen won second place. That's it on the left-hand side. Those are several of the entries, by the way. You could see how futuristic some of the European architects were. Elio Saarinen of Finland never had that skyscraper on the left built. However, it is seen by many to this day as basically an inspiration and even a prototype for Art Deco skyscrapers. And in fact, when Raymond Hood went on to do his next building after the Chicago Tribune Tower, he did one right there with you folks in New York, the American Radiator Building. And it is a pretty clear inspiration. It takes a clear inspiration from that Elio Saarinen drawing. And you don't have to take my word for it. Hood himself wrote in American Architect that Saarinen's drawings had been an inspiration to him in the drawing room as he was designing the American Radiator Building. He said Saarinen, and he named two other architects, reproductions of whose drawings were scattered over our tables as we worked, gave us a lift over many rough places. So this building with its dark terracotta brick was a big sensation. People flocked to see it. It opened in 1924. One of the people that came to see it is Georgia O'Keeffe, the artist who painted it famously. There it is on the left. She did a series of New York skyscraper paintings before she started drawing, her flowers and bones. And these canvases, most particularly the Radiator Building canvas, basically set her on a course to fame. This is what made Georgia O'Keeffe start to become an artistic sensation. Another architect that Hood mentioned as an inspiration was a New York architect named Bertram Goodhue. Now, who's Bertram Goodhue? Well, this is a 1913 New York Times story that is talking to Bertram Goodhue, a very successful young architect in 1913. And he's just done St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue. He's going to do St. Bartholomew on Park Avenue next. And so this cathedral architect gets asked by the New York Times reporter, doesn't it seem to you, the reporter says, that this cathedral building is a strange profession for the 20th century? Isn't the cathedral, after all, an anachronism? And Goodhue says, on the contrary, this is the age of the cathedral. They're rising all over the country. He named several cities that are having new cathedrals, including some that he's commissioned to do: New York, Baltimore, Albany, Denver, Detroit, San Francisco, Cleveland, Los Angeles, Washington. But he's also interested in skyscrapers. So that's Goodhue again. And he enters this 1922 Tribune contest, and his entry is well thought of there on the left, but it doesn't win. But it does sort of borrow something from another winning contest design that he came up with, and that is from a 1920 contest for Nebraska to design the world's first state capitol skyscraper. And that is the building that Bertram Goodhue designed right there. This is a 1920 contest, so a 1920 design with a man sowing wheat on the top. And I mean, in a sense, he was right that it was a cathedral age, because if you go into this building in flyover country, but definitely worth the trip, take a look up, and there's beautiful mosaics of civic virtues in gleaming color. One of the big statements of the Art Deco movement was starting to use more bold, bright primary colors. And the mosaic work on the ceiling is the civic virtues. On the floor is black and white, and it shows prehistoric animals. And those are done all by this wonderful architect, or rather interior designer and muralist named Hildreth Meyer. And this made Hildreth Meyer famous. And in fact, she got jobs, for instance, at Rockefeller Center. She became a famous designer, and many commissions. Sadly, Goodhue never got to see this building. He died before its completion. But speaking of cathedrals and skyscrapers, there's quite a few, and I want to take you through my top 10 not in New York skyscrapers. So that was the first one. This second one is in Tulsa, which Chris mentioned is a city with a wealth of Art Deco. And take a look at this Phil Tower. It's named after Wade Phillips, whose brothers founded Phillips Petroleum. He didn't get in on that gig, but he made some money on his own oil companies. And you could see the top of the building has an O on it, not for oil, but for Oklahoma. But that mixture of colors for the Art Deco exterior and this Gothic fan vaulting in the elevator lobby that looks quite like the cathedral in York or the Minster at York. It's quite a mix, and it's something we saw a lot of in the Art Deco era. Art Deco is a term, as I said, that came only later. And so Gothic still shows up quite a bit in Art Deco buildings across the country. This is what I think is the closest building to Saarinen vision. This is in Houston, and is the Gulf building. And if you take a look at it, it's from the late 1920s, 1929 it opened, and it's kind of as close to a replica of that Saarinen drawing as you can get, with a strong vertical, the ornamental top, the archways. Now, the Gulf building was a huge deal in Texas. It was the tallest skyscraper in Houston, and it was done by a developer named Jesse Jones, who built most of the first skyscrapers in Houston, Dallas, and throughout Texas. He started out with his uncle's lumber yard, and he turned himself into this major developer. He was the Secretary of Commerce under FDR, and he became a really powerful and influential Texan. And if you walk into the banking room, now remember, commissioned in the mid-1920s, 1926, and by this time, you're really seeing that style known as Art Deco, with that three-story banking hall with the chrome and copper and spirals and angles. And in the back, there's a lovely stained glass window of the Battle of San Jacinto when Texas won its independence from Mexico. Art Deco spread across the country like wildfire. This is the Eastern Columbia building in Los Angeles, and it's from 1930. And I love this one because of the clock on top. So it was built for a Jewish immigrant named Adolf Sirati, who first opened a little clock repair shop in Los Angeles. And so the clock, when he finally built his business into a series of department stores and opened his flagship in 1930, that clock had special significance to him. It reminded him of that first clock that he was repairing in his little shop. And frankly, now this building is a condominium, so the clock is to help you, if you swim on the rooftop pool, know if you waited an hour after lunch. And it's a funny side note, but Los Angeles, they were not big fans in Los Angeles of skyscrapers. They wanted that sunlight to reach the streets, so there were strict height limits. So in order to make tall buildings higher than the 12 or 13 maximum stories you could build, a lot of ornamental towers are built. So that's inside the clock tower there. Now up the coast in San Francisco, Pacific Telephone and Telegraph here. San Francisco did not have height limits, and it has a wonderful collection of Art Deco skyscrapers. This one is by Pacific Telephone, and it's by local architect Tim Pfluger, opened in 1925. And what I really love about it, and the exterior, this gray terracotta, is supposedly, Pfluger said, he's a local architect, he said that it was inspired by his visit to the Sierra Nevadas and the big granite mountains and mountain faces there. So he wanted it to be gray. But the interior is Chinese. Look at that. That orange ceiling is like a Chinese folk print. Where would he get these ideas? I mean, Pfluger actually started out as a designer of movie houses. So this is his masterpiece, the Paramount in Oakland, and you can see that use of color. That's Tim, by the way, in the mountains in the Sierras skiing and getting his idea for his first skyscraper. And colors play such a role in that Art Deco movement. This is a mural by Diego Rivera, the famous Mexican artist and muralist. Pfluger was a patron of Rivera and hired him for a lot of jobs. And in this particular mural, you can see a couple interesting things. On the upper left, you can see the building we just looked at. That's the Pacific Telephone building, but also under the man swinging the axe, the balding man in the brown suit is Timothy Pfluger himself. So Rivera has painted him, and also his wife, and Frida Kahlo, and also some of these. It's a 1940 mural, so of course you've got Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin, and Charlie Chaplin. This is one of Chris and my favorite Art Deco buildings in Detroit, the Guardian building. It's just a riot of color, and that's another local architect, Wirt Roland from Detroit, who said he was inspired by a visit to Barcelona, and so he was looking at Antoni Gaudi's use of color and using it for himself. And if you go inside, the colors get even more vibrant. And this is the place, by the way, that Chris mentioned we're going to be demonstrating or exhibiting the Highrises collection in September for the Detroit Month of Design. And responsible for a lot of this tile work was Mary Chase Stratton there on the left, who was the next door neighbor of Wirt Roland, who's there on the right. They lived next to each other. She ran a pottery concern, and he was an architect, and he wanted her to come in and do the glazing and the designs and the interiors for his Guardian building. And so the two of them teamed up. This number 7, the Coppers building, I throw in because I'm a Pittsburgher, as Carol said, and I have to put it here. Coppers is a 1929 skyscraper here in Pittsburgh. You can see in that postcard from my antique collection, it's next to another taller Art Deco skyscraper, another Gulf building. But it was by built for a company made by Heinrich Coppers. He's in the upper left. He invented a way to collect pollution out of smokestacks from coke ovens and turn it into a useful chemical. But I included 2 reasons. One, when I give my tours of skyscrapers here in Pittsburgh, we always start on the balcony of the Coppers building, just below the sign there. But more importantly, Andrew Mellon there on the left, who the building was built for, the powerful Pittsburgh financier, was the Secretary of the Treasury in the United States through the 1920s, and Secretary of the Treasury when the Great Depression happened. So he was blamed by many for causing the Great Depression with his fiscal policies. So in a way, he's kind of the man responsible for us not having as many Art Deco skyscrapers as we'd like. Wrapping up my top 10, number 8, the Alabama Power Building, which is in Birmingham, which has this wonderful golden statue of the goddess Electra, bringing electricity to Birmingham and Alabamians. And Alabamian, I guess that's the word. So there's a story in town that she, every night, when everyone goes to sleep, she comes off the top of the tower and goes up on top of Red Mountain nearby, where there's an iron statue of Vulcan, the god of the forge, and they have a little party. By the way, the reason she's on the top of this building is, well, the board wanted a sign, but the architect prevailed and said, let's put a figure on top. A place where that didn't happen is in Minneapolis, where the gaudiest sign exists that I've seen on a skyscraper. This is Fauché Tower, and it's electric light bulbs, the last name of the developer, Wilbur Fauché, who built this tower, and after he did so, went to Leavenworth prison for financial fraud, for defrauding the investors. That's him and his business manager in their cell in Leavenworth. Perhaps my favorite Art Deco skyscraper is Buffalo City Hall, which has beautiful stonework Chris already showed from René Chambellan, who did a lot of work in New York, but has fantastic colors on the outside, but most importantly on the inside, the interior, where that Guardian building is bright in primary colors. The interior here looks like a Batman villain's lair with, very vivid gloomy shadows and lighting, and fantastic murals like this one here of Lady Buffalo on her throne with people bringing her gifts, such as this muscular pilot without a shirt handing her an airplane. And I'll wrap up with my favorite, final favorite skyscraper not in New York from the Art Deco era. That's Carbide and Carbon building, of course, seen here in a postcard with its gleaming golden top. And it's, well, one you may have seen before because Chris showed it to you. It's on the front of our book, Highrises Art Deco, which we're offering today at a 10% discount if you use the code word skyscraper when you order on our website, which is highrisescollection.com. And other things are available there too, like a cool Art Deco poster. And if you just like to look at all 200 buildings, you can go to highrisescollection.com and flip through all 200. You can see here I've sorted them by city, so you can just look at the New Yorks, but you can go through the whole collection and take your time. And by all means, if you're interested in getting something, use skyscraper as your code through the end of this week and you get 10% off. And I thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, Mark. And Chris, let me come on briefly. I will pose a few questions from the audience, but one of the first things, and so thank you for that, and thank you for your passion for these buildings and the immense amount of time you're willing to devote to this project. The museum completely endorses the idea that you should sell your books to as wide a possible audience. I have to, the disclaimer in terms of the museum is that this book is very tall, and it's kind of taller than bookshelves are for bookstores for limited space. So people can take advantage of the discount, which makes it more affordable as well. But all of we do have the poster in the museum. So those who are in New York can come and get a poster and support the Skyscraper Museum, but we're very happy for you to directly support Chris and Mark in this endeavor. My question would be, because there are technical questions about the drone and all of that, which I'll ask you when I go off the screen, but you have 200 buildings on the website and 100 buildings in the exhibition. Does 200 buildings constitute the entire American collection of skyscrapers that remain? Do you think Chris, you had every single one of them? And then talk about the filtering process, please.
Yeah, it's close. It's close to every one of them. I mean, I can think of a few that I didn't get to. Like there's one in like Dayton, Ohio that I was like close, but it just didn't work out. There's one in somewhere else in Alabama. So there are a couple that were like, oh, it's one building in this city and it's gonna be a huge expense to me to get a hotel and a flight and the whole logistics. So sometimes I had to cut them. But if they were really incredible, I pulled out all the stops, like to go to Lincoln, Nebraska to see one building. Mark and I road tripped out. So the ones that I'm sure that you guys want to see are in the book, and there's a couple stragglers that you might find that aren't.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, also it has to do with the aspect ratio of the art, right? So it needs to be tall and skinny. So there are fatter buildings, and certainly also Chris and I both wanted to show audiences how many beautiful Art Deco and older buildings, by the way, those 200 buildings are not only Art Deco. The book is Art Deco. There are plenty of pre-Art Deco on the website. But anyway, we wanted to show the range, almost 70 cities across the country, and the beautiful Art Deco in places like Philadelphia, where he's from, and Pittsburgh, where I'm from, and many, many other places.
Okay, so I can read the questions on my phone. I'm going to turn my camera off and let me invite anyone to add into the chat or address into the chat a question, and we will go for another 5 or 10 minutes for anybody who wants to ask an additional question. So I'm going to leave the screen. And I think you will be there side by side. Okay, so Lee in the audience is very interested in the editing of the final photographic image and wants to know, did you remove antennas? You know, how much work there of the more either modern editions? You know, the Council on Tall Buildings makes a distinction between the architectural tip of a building and counting that as part of the original concept, and then antennas, which are not a part of the architecture, even if they were originally part of the building campaign. So how do you think about antennas?
Yeah, unfortunately, I didn't from the beginning set a hard stance of whether I wanted to show like how it is existing in reality or if I wanted to show you know, how the designer intended it, maybe without the antennas. So it varies a little bit through the collection, and mostly it's just my own discretion of whether the antennas add interest to the image or if they distract from the original intent of the building. So there's no hard stance on it. It's kind of case by case.
Mhm. Another person gives you compliments for your fantastic photography and fast-paced presentation and wants to know, what are the size and specs of your drone?
The size, I don't know exactly. I mean, it's like, you know, yay big. It's very small. It's a DJI Air 2S is the make and model. So it's really not, it's a like a mid-level consumer drone. It's nothing fancy. It's what, you know, most people that are into drone photography probably have. So really the results are mostly through the editing and through this technique of stitching that the images stand out.
And I'll ask, how much time goes into an individual final photograph?
It ranges from maybe an hour at the quickest, very quickest, to I've spent probably 8 hours on an image before. So, and that's just in the editing, not including like actually traveling there and taking the photos too, and the planning to plan the travel and the planning to get the airspace approvals. So each image is quite an effort.
Mhm. And this is my question, but as a commercial photography enterprise rather than a work of passion and a publication, do you plan to sell the photographs as, let's say, you know, prints or poster sizes, but as signed works? I mean, do you consider them individual artworks, or do you have an aspect of your work where you do that for
Uh,
sale?
yeah, I definitely do. We have prints available on the website. There's the posters that are, you know, cheaper, thinner papers. They're posters, right? And cheaper. And then I do art prints as well that I print myself and they come signed, and those are available on the website.
Yeah, as well as really nice big canvases too that you can get large size.
Mhm. Uh, I think another person is asking, I'm not entirely sure if do you do photography of food, or if he's referring to himself as an architectural historian and photographer of both buildings and food. How do you balance editing from simple, stark images such as color highlights and color changes? In short, how do you differentiate and clarify highlights of realism versus toning for advanced viewing? I'm not sure advanced viewing what that means, but
Yeah, it's a hazy question, but I think the answer would be, or how I interpret it is like, what is the eye of the artist? You know, like how do you decide what's, you know, to lean towards more real or more surreal, or, you know, how saturated are the color? Like all these very subjective decisions that you're making millions of them. If you're editing, you're moving a slider and you're choosing, you know, what you want. And that just takes experience. I've been making images for like almost 10 years. So yeah, it's a really hard thing to define a style and to like, you know, find your voice as an artist, but I would say it just takes time.
mhm. And actually this same person is asking you the question, well, why such attention given to tops? I think you may have more to answer about that, but here's an interesting connection. Was there a personal and almost intimate connection to the building for the project? And by the way, he says, I'm the grandson and great nephew, respectively, of Leon Weiss and Julius Dreyfus, the architects of the Louisiana State Capitol.
Wow. Yeah. One of the fun things about this project is those connections. I've realized I get all kinds of DMs and emails and messages of people with that same kind of connection. And it's fascinating how these buildings have such a legacy, to each and every one of us.
Mm-hmm. And Mark, maybe you'd like to talk a little bit about how the 1920s became a particular love of yours in the history of architecture.
Thanks, Carol. I just think that what's kind of lost, I mean, as I started out by saying that we still think of buildings from that era as skyscrapers, even though they're 100 years old. And there's not other technology that we think of that's 100 years old, that's still the vision that we have in our mind. So they made a powerful impact on our psychology. And that is despite the fact that people were accustomed to skyscrapers already. I mean, we lose that now. We sort of look past some of the older ones, but I mean that you can still look at the Woolworth building right on Broadway, just at the foot of the Brooklyn Bridge. And it's a spectacular piece of technology. It's wondrous. And you can imagine, as I started out by saying, how much it must have blown people's minds to see these skyscrapers popping up for decades. Yet in the 1920s, something changed. And that wasn't limited only to skyscrapers. But I feel like with skyscrapers, Art Deco, as we came to call it, just found its perfect form for expression, right? The front of our book, I'll have to pick it up because I love this. The epigram, is that what we call it? So the opening little quote here, George Gershwin says, a skyscraper is at the same time a triumph of the machine and a tremendous emotional experience. So he's talking about composing jazz music, but the first thing he thinks of in the 1920s is skyscrapers. That's what making music is like. It must be like making a skyscraper. And I feel like that's how you view a city today. A city is, first and foremost, when you try to imagine a city, the first thing you think of is skyscrapers, and that's every city now almost in the world, right? And so this is an American invention we came up with, and we can be proud of it. Even if we don't have the tallest ones anymore, it's still such just a stunning vision, and it's every city.
Well said, and certainly an echo of the mission statement of the Skyscraper Museum as well. So I'm in complete accord. One last message into the chat, because we're just a little bit after 7 o'clock, and this seems that quote in particular seems a very good way to conclude, is that someone wants you to share your website again. So please do that. I mean, just you may speak it, and we can add it to the editing, because this webinar will be turned into a video, which will be on our website and also on our YouTube channel, so people can see it there again. But please do identify your website.
It is highrisescollection.com. highrisescollection.com. There you can see all 200 skyscrapers, read the story about each one, and find a way that you can get a picture of any one of them or the book. And by the way, again, Skyscraper is the code to get 10% off anything off the site, whether that's the book or art or even these cool little phone screens that I have here, which is how I always look at my phone and see the Buffalo City Hall, which I told you is my favorite. Highrisescollection.com.
Great. And we can see it's 7:03. So we thank you for a very entertaining hour. And people can Google Chris Hytha and Mark Houser, which is another way that I'm sure you will find an immediate search answer for this wonderful book, Highrises Art Deco. So thanks everybody for joining us tonight, and thanks Chris for a really entertaining evening and for a great book.